Tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Tipping point. Welcome, good morning. Mike Boyle at the controls, and I'm very blessed to have a guest from Cape Town today, Michael Haupt. Michael is a grassroots activist and is the founder of Life Legacy AI. But more important is not just what Michael has been doing generally, but the last 2 days that Michael has gone through, I think would be very interesting for us to explore. So again, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today. And perhaps if you could tell us a lot about those last 2 days.
Great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. So we had an incident. This is what we're told. We don't know exactly what happened, but we were without power for just over 40 hours. Now, to put that in context, South Africa is under general load shedding at the moment, which means in blocks of 2 hours at a time, there are scheduled times when the power is switched off, and it can be up to a total of about 6 hours a day. So we're used to juggling this sort of thing. You know, everybody's got generators or UPSs or battery backup, solar. But for it to be down for 40 hours is quite something. It makes you realize how dependent we are on power. What was incredible for me to see, admittedly, I doubt this would have happened in a city, but because we're in a fairly rural area, there's a small village here and total settlement of about 20,000 people in the valley that we're in. But to see the resilience and to see people cooperating together, working together, sharing resources, restaurants in particular offering, unlimited power to anybody who wanted to come and sit and use their facilities. It was really heartwarming. It rekindled my faith in human nature.
Not only that, but we have a number of things that we hold in common. One of the big draws for me was your identity tied to regeneration. And I think that the example that you gave was very indicative of how if we follow the path that is to be found within nature, that the resilience is quite normal.
Yeah, there's so much we can unpack here. So a little about my background. I mean, I've been an activist for many, many years. I can tell you a bit about the personal journey if that's of interest as we get into it. But initially, I wanted to make big differences in cities. When I returned to South Africa, we thought that maybe the political route was one way to go. But there seems to be an energy in cities that drive people apart from each other. And so that's why I've moved back into a rural area now. The difference in feeling between the people, cities compared to rural areas is just profound. And frankly, at the moment, I think there's very little hope for cities as things become worse and worse. The first place you're going to get social unrest is in cities. And we'll talk a little bit later about collapsology and so on, but we're in the middle of collapse. And the first places we'll see it are cities that are incredibly unhappy, and there's many reasons for citizens to be hopelessly disappointed, dissatisfied, and unhappy with their leaders, in government, in religion, in politics. There's just an absolute failure of leadership worldwide. But let's keep this positive.
Do you believe that state that you were referring to is based upon some systemic elements that drive us to that point, or is it perhaps something coming directly from the populace that are naturally moved towards cities?
So there's a huge body of work called collapsology, and it's basically people who've dedicated their entire lives to studying a specific collapse of a specific civilization. And then there have been some meta studies, people who have studied each of those books to try and identify patterns and see if we can learn from history and then predict what's going to happen. Now, the biggest lesson I got, so I mean, I've read hundreds of books now in this space, and it's profound the amount of work that has been put into it. So it appears there are a number of common things that occur as civilizations start developing. Firstly, there's a very specific cycle of 7 phases that each civilization goes through. And the second observation is that all class-based civilizations eventually collapse. There has not been a single class-based civilization that has survived. And a class-based civilization starts off with division of labor. In other words, we identify as different roles in society, and when extrapolated, those roles, the differences in roles, eventually lead to the 1%. The 1% of the group of people that understand how best to abuse the system and to concentrate wealth in their own hands. And in the process of abusing the system, the middle of the pyramid is hollowed out and it eventually collapses. Now, this is guaranteed. You know, whenever we look at history, there's no question that it's going to happen now. What surprised me in the body of work, though, is that nobody has analyzed those 7 distinct phases and overlaid it on our current globalized civilization. I've now done that work, and it's incredible to see where we are, how each of the phases have followed very specifically, and we've identified the dates of each phase now. And we're about to enter the 7th phase, which is total collapse. It starts with totalitarian power, and during COVID, we saw, you know, very strong examples of that being implemented in various cities around the world. I believe personally that things are going to get worse under the name of climate change. There's all kinds of restrictions already openly proposed under the guise of supposedly stopping a very natural cycle. And slowly the pressure is going to be increased on citizens, and eventually the point will come where they say no more. And it's at that point that full-on collapse will be in place.
Interesting you mentioned climate change, because very often we will focus on the point that is the symptom, but not the root cause.
Mm-hmm.
Following that, what is immediately interesting to me from these 7 phases, if we were to look at various kingdoms or power bases like the UK or the United States today, or however way we want to look at that,
Mm-hmm.
it was usually based upon a country that was going through phases. And the way you're phrasing it is if we are all in that same category. So perhaps if you could elaborate a little bit on why all of us at the same time, although that we are in different levels of development.
Yeah, it's a great point. And this took a little bit of figuring out. So bear with me, I may have this wrong. But if we go back,
I'm curious.
If we go back to the previous civilization that collapsed, which was the Byzantine Empire, there was a period of about 100 years soon after that empire had collapsed, where there was immense war across Europe. They called it, I think, the 80-year and the 100 Years' War, something like that. But during that time, a group of traders realized, rather than focusing on the Mediterranean Sea, which is mainly where the Roman and Byzantine trade routes were concentrated, they said, let's go and create a new playground. And they migrated north and created new trade routes in the Baltic and Northern Seas. That group of traders was called the Hanseatic League. And they became so successful because they created entirely new rules around trading and all those good things. They wanted to put the Byzantine Empire behind them completely, because they were very much oppressed by the Roman Church, Roman centurions, and so on. And so the flourishing of their trade networks eventually led to the distribution of Protestant ideas. So firstly, the printing press created the spread of the theses. Sorry, I've just forgotten what that was. But the ultimate growth of this trade eventually led to the European Renaissance. So there was this huge burst in human creativity, art, music. We're familiar with what happened in that period. And another very interesting thing came out of that. We had the introduction of double entry accounting. At the time, it was the merchants of Venice that were introducing more widespread international trade, and they needed ways of keeping a check of this. So double entry accounting is part of that Renaissance period. That then spread to the US, and so firstly, the period of peace, as a result of the work that the Hanseatic League was doing, was called the Peace of Westphalia. And Americans were very influenced by what was happening in Europe at the time. And so if we use 1648, which was the date of the Peace of Westphalia, as the start of these new ideas emerging, the first glimmer of a totally new form of civilization, which was happening roughly simultaneously in Europe and the US. In the US in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was the kind of start date of their process. So if we use that period between 1648 and 1776 as the start of the globalized trade, we then can, I don't know how much detail you want to go through in all of the phases, but basically what happened is during the expansion and prosperity phase, something called the Monroe Doctrine was the start of the US actively making the claim that they wanted to be a global superpower. And then there was some tension between the UK and the US, a bit of a race or power struggles at various stages through this long history. But when Thatcher and the US president, whose name is just slipped my mind, Reagan, thank you, when they both came into power, that was now the birth of neoliberalism as an economic system. And that economic system has been globally adopted, hence the globalized nature of our world. Now, of course, within that, each country is at different phases, but it's now the economic system that is the symbol of this particular civilization, this globalized civilization. And it's that economic system that is now being hollowed out in the middle through the process of neoliberalism. Let me stop there because I've covered a lot. Does that make sense so far?
Oh, it does. And I'm familiar with a lot of these dates that you had mentioned, but I tend to think that, and perhaps maybe it has nothing to do with the phase, but it has the effect, because these are two separate things, that the effect that this turmoil is going to cause for certain countries are going to be greater for some, less for others, based upon, I'm going to call it a frugal nature, that a number of countries in the global south, in spite of everything, in spite of all of our efforts, and here I must say, that they have a special resilience for two major reasons. I'm kind of I'm just thinking out loud here. One of them is their closeness to nature would be number one, because we're so far removed. The second one is in the frugal way that they do things. They are basing things on sufficiency, and that's good enough.
Yep.
Partially due to the situation, but I think it's a natural element that we had at one time and we've lost it. Your thoughts on that?
Very much agree with that, and I would add in parallel, the nature of each nation's leadership also plays a key role at the same time. And what I mean by that is, if you look back to the COVID period, the countries that had the most draconian implementation of lockdowns, each of those countries' leaders were previously young global leaders or were in some way connected with the early World Economic Forum training programs. And that coincidence cannot be overlooked. What it means is that there is an ideological mindset that has been, and Klaus Schwab has said this many times, he's proud of the fact that he's been able to infiltrate the governments of various nations and so on with his leaders, with his lackeys. So it's a combination of the frugalness, resilience, self-sovereignty of the citizens themselves, and at the same time we need to consider the ideology of the nation's leader. And I haven't looked at this scientifically, but I would guess that a resilient citizenry is unlikely to have a draconian totalitarian leader in them, because the citizenry would not permit that to happen. It's when you get a docile and highly accepting citizenry that you manage to get a totalitarian leader into power.
That is to assume that the populace has an effect on that of what's taking place on a middle level within their region. I can give you one example of somebody that I've been working with rather closely, regenerative agriculture in Uganda. If we know the political situation in Uganda, and one that's clearly not getting any better, then you have to really admire those that, in spite of all of that, have their heads straight on and are looking to manage things in a truly regenerative way and understand that the regeneration leads to the self-sufficiency, which in my mind is a clear component of that of what we're talking about here, and that power exists in the collective resiliency that is to be found within the populace within their area, and they don't really care about anything outside of that, simply because that's good enough for them and they feel that that's something they can master.
Yep. So, and this conversation ties into this rise and fall of civilizations, because usually what happens is there's an overlapping period where the majority of the citizenry have become lazy, decadent, drop in morals. As that part of the collapse is happening, a group of people realize that this is going on and break away from it and focus specifically on sovereignty and independence. So if we use the US 1776, what led to that was the American War prior to it, when a whole bunch of Americans decided we don't want to be controlled by the British anymore. We're feeling, put under pressure. So let's break free from that. We want to write our own rules and constitution. So there's this immense burst of a desire for a small group of people. It's never the whole citizenry. It's a tiny percentage. And they work really hard because they are so passionate. But the point of this is that a hallmark of the emergent civilization is all around self-sufficiency, resilience. And so wherever you see regenerative agriculture practices happening now, those are very strong indicators that that country is prime for some form of emergence. And what we're doing here in the Valley is to ideally prototype a workable, completely resilient, geographically bound or bioregionally bound area where we demonstrate what it means to bootstrap a new form of civilization literally from nothing. And if we can get that right, that potentially could be a very useful model for other places that are keen to do the same thing to follow. So that's a mix of not only regenerative agriculture and taking responsibility for all services that are currently provided. So it's your food production, it's waste removal, it's energy production, everything that makes a community of people work, accepting the responsibilities that up until now have been abdicated. This is part of the rise of a civilization. As the civilization becomes successful, the citizenry hand over, abdicate responsibility for all those services that they used to do themselves. And then there's slowly a return to that. And those that can accept the responsibility most readily are the ones that emerged most strongly out of the inevitable collapse.
Reminds me of a conversation I had yesterday with some people here locally, and talking about very similar issues, coming up with regional development where that self-sufficiency would be found. And the challenge that we have very often in getting people to look beyond wherever that area is that they find themselves to be. And the description that was given to me was quite interesting, where the individual was talking about a group of artists, and artists in a very positive sense, that are able to be extremely creative, are able to perform various actions, are resilient by nature because that's how they were built. Mm-hmm. And that is the situation that they put themselves in, that they had to be resilient. that was a very conscious decision.
Mm.
But the struggle that I'm hearing about, or what I heard about yesterday, was trying to get those people who actually have a lot of knowledge, and you referred to this one, Michael, the knowledge that is to be found within these communities, but they just don't have the time to go beyond whatever they consider their here and now to be. And I'm just curious to see whether you have run across parallels on your end.
So for context, I've spent more than 15 years now in the systemic change space. So I've seen, the world's best projects around on the planet, met unbelievably inspiring people. There really is a huge amount of incredibly interesting stuff happening. So my belief is that we have absolutely everything we need to go to full-on self-sustainability. The question that is relevant to each bioregion is the drive and determination of the people who happen to be in that area. So where there are people that have no interest whatsoever, let's take any one of the big cities around the world, there's no desire to be resilient, at least not at a general scale within all of the residents of that city. And so it's unlikely that it's going to happen there. But when you come out into a rural area, and specifically where we are here, there is such desperation and such immense pressure internally to do something, because it's very clear that the people in the recent past that we expected to do something are incapable or unwilling, or whatever the reason is, nothing is happening. Things are getting worse and worse and worse. And those people then come together, and this 40-hour period of being without power was actually a beautiful demonstration of that is the human drive. Cooperation is the human drive, and collaboration. So it's a case of, if you can imagine erecting a huge circus tent, it's quite a period of planning everything, of laying out the poles and the ropes and all the rest, and then the huge crane will come in right at the last minute and lift the entire tent. So we're in that phase now of getting all the bits and pieces together, and then getting the mindsets of everybody aligned to the point of everyone agreeing, actually, we can do this. We don't need outside assistance. And when you get to that point, that's when the circus tent is miraculously raised up, in a few minutes.
15 years, that's a long time. And you are clearly not where you were 15 years ago. I'd be very curious to hear about that journey, and perhaps what that impetus was. What was your impetus to take part in that journey, and maybe some of your realizations along the way?
Some of them were more whacks on the side of the head than realizations, but so my quick, the 50,000 foot version of my life story, I've had two very different careers. The first was a left-brained, pragmatic, technological career. I helped launch mobile telephony in South Africa in '94. We were quite far behind the rest of the world. And through sheer luck, that project went particularly well. So I was headhunted, and my first stop was Sydney, Australia, and then ended up living in 16 cities on 6 continents, implementing these high-end computer systems. My last assignment was in Taipei, Taiwan. And my then girlfriend and I decided we'd go backpacking through Asia, because I'd done work in Bangkok before, but had never had the chance to travel around. And it was on that backpacking journey that I had a completely unexpected out-of-body experience on a beach in Thailand. Now, I certainly wasn't going on any kind of spiritual quest, and as far as I know, there was no substance involved. I didn't take anything. I have been told that maybe something was slipped into a drink. It's possible, but I don't think so. And I believe it was the universe's way of whacking me on the side of the head and saying, time for you to wake up. And I'm very pleased that it happened. I mean, it was a shocking experience. As a left-brain pragmatist, I ended up taking a 2-year sabbatical in a desperate attempt to search for to answers as to, what on earth had just happened, because it was a very real experience for me. And in that process, dived deep down the rabbit hole of consciousness research, discovered work that I had no idea existed. So when your worldview is changed as radically as that, it's not easy to go back into the corporate world. I did try for some time, got a position in London, but I was never happy. And that's when I discovered the systemic change space through an introduction of a friend. Again, slowly saw more and more of what was going on. Met really interesting people, incredibly inspiring people. Now, it was at that time that the Bitcoin white paper came out. That was 2009, if I remember correctly. I must just mention one other thing that happened in the outer body experience is I was given a crystal clear vision in immense detail of some kind of future society. There was so much detail that I spent 3 days without sleep, just writing down everything I could remember longhand. As the memory came back to me, I wrote it down. And most of it made no sense. There was definitely this concept of a community currency, of different forms of incentive systems. But 5 years prior to Bitcoin, it was so foreign to me that I had no idea where this came from. And I didn't know what to do with all of that. So at the end of every year, I would just page through that diary to remind myself. And even I think what I was doing is immersing the vision into my DNA so that it became embodied in me. It's something that a common question I often get is, well, can you describe the vision? And the short answer is no, because there was so much detail. I subsequently wrote something, and there is postcards from 2035, the brief version of that. So I decided at one point, I'm now the solo dad of a daughter who will turn 21 years old in 2035. Forgive me, I'm going on a bit of a meander here, but it'll make sense. Now, for context, I've avoided having children. I'm in my late 50s now, and my worldview always was the world is a messed up place. And if that's true, why would you want to bring a young defenseless kid into it? But then in 2013, I had a fling and she fell pregnant. And so now I'm the solo dad to somebody who will turn 21 in 2035. And my commitment as the best 21st birthday gift I can think of is to give her a workable prototype, at least, of the vision that was given to me way back in 2004. So next year is 2024. It's the 20-year anniversary of the date that vision was given to me. And Gracie, my daughter, turns 21 in 2035. So I took the lessons that I learned from the blockchain space, plus the vision that was given to me. And while in the blockchain space, I realized that the technologists who understand blockchain, if we as a person in the street ask them to describe it, their explanation is way too technical and it just goes over our head. So Postcards from 2035 is written from the perspective of my daughter as a 21-year-old woman, writing back to us today, describing to us what her day-to-day life is like. But all of it influenced by the stuff that I researched in the blockchain space, plus this vision that was given to me. And slowly, all of it, something that in 2004 appeared completely ridiculous and inconceivable, is now happening all over the world in many, many different places. So the vision I found has proven a very useful North Star for me, because I've seen a lot of crazy ideas in the blockchain and crypto space. But when you've got a reference point with as much detail as that vision, it's fairly easy to see through somebody who's taking a chance, basically. And there's many of them.
There are a couple of things that immediately struck out from that of what you were telling us. First one is that knowledge, in whatever form it may be, has to exist in us in some fashion. It has to be part of our corpus. Otherwise, we would not be able to acknowledge it, to understand it, and to take it and run with it. Whether it is totally innate or part of our environment is open to question. Probably it's a combination of both. But that meant that something had to already be there for you to have that revelation. What are your thoughts on that?
I do believe in divine inspiration. In other words, there is something in the collective consciousness, whatever you refer, whether it be a spiritual being or a religious being or a greater power that we are yet to meet. And within that field of collective consciousness, that knowledge exists already. But because of our backgrounds, our training, our education, our ways of thinking, our up till now independence, we haven't, I'm generalizing hugely now, but most people haven't learned how to tap into that. And so for those who haven't experienced, and there's many people who've had similar experiences to me, and I think the reason that those experiences haven't resulted in anything is because it is so overwhelming that for the majority, it's easier to forget the experience than to try and get your head around it and figure out, well, what do I do with this? So I think there are far more manifestations of this kind of direct knowledge transfer. But because our education system doesn't teach us how to deal with this sort of stuff, most of it is wasted. That's a completely personal opinion, and I have no evidence to back that up. But it's.
I'm afraid I would be lying if I said I would disagree with you. To use a double negative.
Right.
But one thing was for sure in the message that you're giving us. I hear that in 2004 you went from me to we. In some fashion.
I think it took the 2 years of the sabbatical to get to the we position.
Mm-hmm.
But I would never have got there had there not been the whack on the side of the head. So it was very much that single experience, which I don't know how long it took, but it wasn't, it was a flash in the moment. That was very clearly the start of a very significant shift. Now, if I may quickly go back to this concept of knowledge. So in the blockchain space, what I ended up doing was writing investor analyses of various blockchain projects. So each blockchain project would write a white paper. I'd have to review the white paper and then write a fairly critical report on whether an investor should get involved or not. Because I didn't get involved in a single blockchain project, but scanned, the whole horizon of what was going on, that was the key thing I found so profound. Here was this brand new technology that literally appeared on the scene overnight, but already in the zeitgeist, people from far-flung geographic places with completely different cultural backgrounds were all very suddenly writing about the same or imagining or bringing into reality various projects that had a very common field to them. And that common field was far beyond anything that existed in the technological space at the time. I remember being profoundly moved by this, that there was something in the knowledge bank that was beyond purely human ingenuity. I'm struggling to describe it, but hopefully you get the sense of where I'm coming from there. The zeitgeist was profound.
Mind you, I don't think that such a phenomena is totally unique. I believe that we have had that epiphany, let's call it a collective epiphany, in various forms throughout the ages. I think part of it is tied to our obsessive attitude towards empirical way of managing things.
Correct.
And which forces us to negate those things that are actually very natural because nature is not to be controlled, to put it very bluntly.
Yeah.
I don't want to forget one of the reasons why we're here together is to talk about regenerative funding. So I have one more question, and it was all tied to the story you told us about your daughter. And that your thought process was, how could I ever bring children into this world? But you found a way to be resilient in another form.
Again, I think my daughter was another one of those whacks on the side of the head by the universe, because the simple process of her birth turned me 180 degrees from somebody who was an immense critic of the system. This is wrong and that is wrong and this needs to be fixed. And from that kind of person to somebody who says, well, you are now responsible for the thing that you've been trying to avoid your entire life. You need to do something about this. Hence the concept of the 21st birthday gift. So, you know, to, for somebody like myself to make such a radical turn as a result of an incident or an occurrence, that wasn't planned and certainly not anticipated, is to me an indication of how, if we use events, significant events, I'm not talking about day-to-day events, but when something significant happens in your life, when you view that as a teacher, that event as a teacher, rather than, oh, this is a calamity, look how my life has been destroyed, then I think we'd see real human progress forward. I don't know if that accurately answers the question, or the direction in which you were going.
Oh, I think it does. And there was one word that you didn't use that I kept hearing indirectly, and that was the concept of acceptance. Although I know that you are a firm believer in that based upon our conversations previous, but the real power is to be found in the ability to accept whatever it may be in other individuals, in our situation, in our abilities, in our failings. It's all tied to this acceptance that's required for us to truly make progress. And that's what I heard.
Yes. I would maybe go one step further, because part of that acceptance to me is that every single one of us are here at this moment in time for a very, very specific reason. There is a very clear reason why the universe brought each of us, 7 or 8 billion people, to the planet now. And the sad reality is most of them will never, firstly, identify what that purpose is, and then accept that purpose and accept the responsibility that is tied to that purpose. And until a higher percentage of us get to that point, we're actually holding the rest of humanity back. In other words, we're so close to a tipping point now. We are at the point of either making one of these, you used the word epiphany before, an epiphanous, momentous leap forward, where humanity has been before, and those leaps were successfully made. And there have been other times when those leaps were unsuccessful, and it ended up in immense repression and totalitarian, crushing of the human spirit, where millions of people died in short periods of time. So we're sitting at that point where either outcomes are a possibility, and it is up to us which of those outcomes are going to be most experienced, or experienced by the most people on the planet. So this is a pretty significant consideration of us finding out and becoming comfortable with why me, why now?
And for someone who has based this creative endeavor that we are currently involved with on the radio tied to empowerment and inclusiveness, then I think that with that we've closed the loop, because really what you're talking about is empowerment. You are, for lack of a better term, you are a connector. You are trying to bring people together in a format where they can naturally commingle and fulfill various needs that we have. Can you tell us a little bit about your regenerative undertaking, specifically trying to bring different groups in our society together?
So firstly, thanks very much for asking. I'm incredibly passionate about this, and particularly having some amazing meetings and connections, literally mind-blowing stuff. But if I may, before going into that, just to take a little bit of a step back. So one of the things that need to be accepted from a worldview perspective is that our current monetary system, specifically a debt-based monetary system, is at the core of the majority of social issues that we are experiencing, including climate change. And the reason that is because a debt-based system, which was renounced by all of the major religions, is the system that requires constant growth. And that is because as you take a loan, interest has to be paid back on that loan. So there's a constantly increasing amount that needs to be repaid. And the only way you can do that is to constantly increase production. And the only way you can do that is to constantly use up natural resources. So we are in a catch-22 situation until we transcend the monetary system itself. Now, that's a profoundly difficult thing to get one's head around. But when you do, you then step into the space of regenerative activities. And you then recognize that a truly regenerative activity is the complete anathema to an economic system driven by a debt-based monetary system. And so you're actually saying, in order for me to fund my regenerative activity, I have to go to the capitalist system and ask somebody who's been successful in that system if they will please fund my activity, which will undermine the success of whatever they've created in that system. So it's the entire thing makes no sense whatsoever. And it took me a long time to get to the point of understanding why it's so difficult to fund regenerative activities. But once you get to that point of understanding, you can then say, it makes no sense for us to go to venture capitalists, seed investors, all of the traditional mechanisms of funding regenerative projects, initiatives will never, ever work. And so let's stop wasting time going down that avenue. And then the question is, okay, well, which direction do I go now? I've just got a worker outside who's scratching old paint off the roof. Is the sound okay? Otherwise, I must.
We're doing great.
Oh, fabulous.
Maybe if I can just, because you've given me this opportunity, just quickly interject something. You cannot imagine how much of what you're talking about is the basis of what we cover in the show. So I'm very appreciative. Continue, please,
Mike. Show more often then, which I haven't been doing, unfortunately. So, but anyway, it's useful to get to that point of understanding. It's much more useful if you can come up with something that's that addresses the challenges. And I was very fortunate over December this past year to have an unexpected conversation with a conscious high net worth individual who came to me saying, we as a group of friends, of wealthy friends, we want to leave a legacy that is stamped with the hallmarks of what's emerging rather than what's collapsing. Now, that to me was a mind-blowing way to start a conversation, but I was, of course, immediately interested. And so we've developed those conversations over time. Now, what she said to me, though, is, please, I'm not interested in any project that is concerned about climate change, about carbon sequestration, about feeding the poor, about addressing any single symptom of our total systemic issues. So you figure out how to bring those projects to me that don't give me a guilt trip about climate change, because that's not what I'm going to do with my money. And so what we've pulled together now is an ecosystem for regenerative funding, where we are intending to build the bridge between conscious high net worth individuals who want to leave a legacy of what's emerging and true regenerative projects. So we're just getting going. The first cohort kicks off on the 5th of May. So we're busy getting quite a bit of interest on that. I've been very pleasantly surprised, because this was putting something out into the universe that I was very nervous and concerned about. And there was no reason for me to be concerned about it, because things are aligning universally for this to be a natural outcome of where humanity is going anyway. So I'm being the messenger. I'm literally on a nightly basis receiving the next indications of where we lead this process towards, and to remain as pure a channel as possible. That's my big intent with this. So already we've made 3 major adjustments to the program as it was originally launched. But I'd be happy to share some details, if I may, about where your listeners can find some more information.
Sure. I thought what we can do is leave some information tied to the show notes, so that for those individuals who would be interested in pursuing the avenue that you are offering, and also I'm making in the general assumption that if they were to reach out to you and get to know you and perhaps provide some support, you will not say no. So everything we can do in that direction is something very positive. So we'll make sure that we have that covered. When we talk about regeneration, we are, I mean, the word, the most bastardized word I think we have in the English language these days is sustainability. But if we were to take that, if we were to take the true meaning of something that's sustainable, it means it's a steady state. It means you'll have some changes on one side that will cause the other side to balance things out. That's a heavy undertaking for a system that has been based upon the debt and the growth that you referred to. So apart from coming up with the funding, any suggestions as to what kind of structural changes can be made? Because I know you've thought about it.
Well, the first realization is this is an incredibly messy exercise that we're contemplating. However, it has happened before in history, and so we have some examples that we can follow. Specifically, the Hanseatic League that I mentioned earlier, they showed how they created an entirely different playground with different playground rules, and in the process created a huge leap forward, at least for Northern Europe, that led to the European Renaissance. So if we take them and their approach as an inspiration, and all that we're doing, if we distill it down to the simplest factors, is we are creating healthy value flows out of the system that will inevitably collapse. There's no question that the collapse is coming, into this playground where an emergent form of civilization, which has not yet been defined, we don't know exactly what it's going to be. But if we can just get our head around this concept of healthy value flows out of one system into another system, and as you start reformulating conversations around that space, it is unbelievable what emerges. So although we are facing some immensely complex challenges, I think by reframing it, we can simplify the process quite significantly, particularly considering that there have been many civilizations that have been through this same process before. So for me now, it's no longer an issue of trying to solve anything, but how smooth we can make the transition that has to happen anyway. And if we look at all the examples that have been left for us in history, there's an immense amount that can be done. The true challenge for me is that we don't replicate another class-based civilization as this thing emerges, because if you do that, you're simply repeating the cycle, and we haven't learned our karmic lesson well enough yet, and then the next few generations have to go through the same thing. The alternative to a class-based society is a values-based society. And I'm excited to be in South Africa, back in South Africa, because the longest surviving values-based civilization are the Khoisan of Southern Africa. Now, we don't have much knowledge of their governance systems because their traditions are all passed on verbally, but there are individuals in the world that have done a huge amount of work around this, and we're pulling that information together. You may be familiar that in the blockchain space, there's all kinds of very interesting projects going on around decentralized governance. So if you can merge those ways of thinking with a values-based civilization, I think, this is a real chance for humanity to make that leap forward that we so desperately need, to be frank.
Perhaps the problem is to be found on my side, because I think a lot about these things as well. And I think about power. And as much as we would love to say that it's not important, it is in all relationships. I'm firmly convinced. It might happen in a very small way or maybe in a larger way. But we've built the system where not only is it based on debt, as you described, but it's also based on future valuation. So when I think about the price equity ratio, just using that as an example, we're not talking about the actual value today, but we're talking about the perceived value in a certain period of time. How much did those investors believe they are going to get out of whatever money they've invested? We have this cockamamie system where we take finite resources and we consider them to be profit. But through the initiatives that we've been talking about, generally, we are saying that those resources should remain in the ground. The problem that we have is this concept of stranded assets, meaning that they had a value, we're taking that value away. I don't know about you, but I don't think anybody who's confronted with that situation, be it the one who owns these resources or the ones that have invested in the resources, are going to roll over and play dead. So how do we deal with that one?
You have a knack of asking the most challenging questions. So
I've been working on it.
So firstly, I think, and I mean, in the time left, we're not going to be able to scratch this itch much further than just a
No,
little.
of course not.
But the issue for us, as far as we understand a very complex space that you've just described, is this idea of ownership. So in a values-based civilization, there is no concept of ownership. There is commonage and there is access to resources. So some of the things we're experimenting with, and some of those experiments are quite far developed, is placing land, for example, into land trusts and then selling benefits that come off the land in something like an NFT, a non-fungible token, which is a crypto process, and then measuring the increasing or decreasing value of that NFT based on some very specific, for example, soil measurements. So it would be a pH balance or water retention capabilities, or whatever the soil scientists tell us we need to be focusing on. Now the value of your NFT is not dependent on whether somebody wants desperate access to a physical asset or whether they want to be associated with the improving quality of that same piece of land. And then you can take stranded assets. So for example, in South Africa, there are abandoned Air Force fields with huge swaths of land around them that cannot be used because they're currently government owned. But take those stranded assets and put them into a mechanism like this. There's faith-based land that has been bought by very wealthy religious groups, and they don't know what to do with them. So put them into a process like that as well. So now you're shifting the concept of ownership into a concept of stewardship, and your human labor and ingenuity is directly invested in the improvement of an asset. But now we're asking your listeners and everybody else to think completely differently about how the world currently works, which is we must run out there, get the best job so that we can acquire the most assets before we finally lie on our deathbed. So it's not a simple shift. Fortunately, a number of people have made the shift, and that's why there's so many people working in this space. But it's not an easy one to make, and the race is on to see how quickly that shift can be made.
You're completely right that for us to explore this particular subject, we could never give it proper credence within the short period of time that we still have. But maybe if I just make a quick note here, we can definitely take this one offline, that there's a big movement tied towards steward ownership, especially with regards to property and corporations as well. So there is something clearly there, and people are seeing the value. And I can talk about what's taking place here in Central Europe and give you plenty of examples. So I don't think it's all that unique. I like to think that there's plenty of positive examples, but I see the clock is ticking, and I want to give you, Michael, an opportunity with a few closing words before we say goodbye for today.
Well, if I may pick up on your comment there about none of these projects are unique. You're correct that in the zeitgeist, all over the world, in supposedly disconnected pockets of activities, very similar activities are going on. Which comes back to this knowledge, field of knowledge, the idea that this is almost innate in the human drive is to make those leaps forward when the time is right. I think the challenge at the moment is to make it workable, because I'm aware of hundreds of projects around the world, all struggling because there's a little bit of seed funding from the existing capitalist system required, because you need material or some tools and equipment and all the rest. But we're sitting in that kind of stagnating period of people sitting with great ideas but can't quite bring them to fruition. So that's the challenge that we're hoping to solve, because once you unlock that value flow, then it happens very, very quickly. And all of these hundreds of projects around the planet will spring into action, like that circus tent that we mentioned. You know, they're lying completely invisible because they're flat on the ground, but then overnight they just spring up. And that's when you're going to see the human spirit on a global level reignited and re-inspired to, you know, where people genuinely feel a purpose, because there's lots of loss of purpose right now. People are despairing. So if I may invite your visitors to come and have a look at lifelegacyai.com/beta, BETA, because it's our first cohort that we're running. I'll be grateful if we could include the link
Sure, of
in the
course.
show notes.
Mhm.
There's various options of getting involved. There is a cost, but there's also some scholarship application processes. So we're trying to make this as open as possible for everyone to eventually participate in this. And it's a series of dialogues, 9 dialogues in a very specific format, following very specific topics, many of them similar to what we've covered today. But it's the participants of each cohort that guide the outcome of those dialogues. So I started off it being a teaching series, and then realized, well, that's very arrogant of you, Michael Haupt, to think that you can teach any of these bright people anything. So we've turned them into a series of dialogues anyway. Michael, this has been fantastic. Thank you. You're a wonderful host. You certainly know your stuff, and it's been an absolute delight chatting with you.